The essence of the book, the real essence of the book, is the immigration obstacles that confronted Jewish refugees during the Holocaust years 1938 to 1940. Of course, it's a story about my parents, but they epitomize and represent what most Viennese Jews went through in order to escape the Holocaust. And the other thing that the book points to is, or underscores, the importance of America to refugees seeking racial and religious freedom. And I hope that it again points to the importance of our country standing true to its values and gives a real meaning to what our Statue of Liberty stands for.
Yes.
So this is a picture of my parents. My father's 25, my mom's 19. My dad was a student at the Vienna Technical Institute in Vienna. And my mom worked for an import-export firm as a translator. She was fluent in English, German, French, Italian, Spanish, and as far as I know, Yiddish.
Wow.
So one of the things I like to point out so people understand the circumstances of Europe and particularly Vienna at that time is the social political environment. During the years 1923 to 1934, which was basically my father's youth, the government was populated with social democrats, which was called the Workers' Party. And at that same time, there were conflicting ideologies and political discord as a result of those various parties that were in conflict with one another. At that same time, 1934, the head of the political leadership in Austria was Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, who at the time was aligned with the Christian Conservative Party and the fascist party run by Benito Mussolini in Italy. So my father early on at age 12 was very active politically and joined the youth wing of the Social Democratic Party, which at the time was called the Red Falcons. Not to be confused, of course, with the Boy Scouts of America. It wasn't the same kind of situation. At 19, he joined the Chutzpah, which was the military affiliation of the academic, which he was also a part of as a result of his attending the Vienna Technical Institute. The Chutzpah, which pictured to the left of your screen in military garb, was sworn to protect the social democracy, which they did so in 1934 when they attempted a coup as a result of the fascist and Nazi party gaining control of the government in Vienna. So they took matters into their own hands and attempted a coup, and unfortunately they were smashed by Dollfuss, who used his tanks and artillery to beat down the revolt.
Oh.
So about 4 years later, was the Anschluss, which I consider to be phase one of the real anti-Semitic acceleration that took place in Vienna. And the Anschluss was Hitler's attempt, which he was able to actualize on March 12th, of a union between Germany and Austria. And of course, when his military marched into Austria at the time, it had absolutely no resistance whatsoever. In fact, the citizens of Austria pelted the soldiers with flowers to welcome them. So Hitler then decided that in order to demonstrate to the world that the unification was wanted by the Austrians, held a plebiscite on April 10, 1938, which was a vote to approve Hitler's Greater Germany. And allegedly 99% of the population approved the unification, and Hitler taking over Austria. Of course, Jews were not allowed to vote at that time. The restrictions that came into focus were and followed were modeled from Germany's Nuremberg laws of 1935, and as a result, Jewish people lost their jobs, their educational capabilities, their homes, their businesses, transportations, and various kinds of humiliations took effect, including pictures that you might have seen where they're shown scrubbing sidewalks and eating grass. So my father at that time was forced to quit the university. All school children, of course, Jewish school children, were forced out as well. The picture in the middle of the screen is actually the Nazis forming a line to prevent Jews from entering my father's University of Vienna Technical Institute. And I thought I'd include that because it was interesting to me. And the picture to the right is my father's student ID at the Technical Institute. And you can notice on the bottom right, the Nazi insignia with the eagle and the swastika. In any event, the Anschluss, as you might imagine, with the German soldiers marching into Austria and the humiliations that preceded, put most Jews, if not all Jews, into a state of panic in Austria, where they knew that no good was in store for them. So most of them wanted to leave at that time. The affluent, of course, sought passage to places like America, Latin America, Palestine, and even China. But the elderly were, pretty much set in their ways. In fact, many of them had come from various countries, such as Poland, where they had pogroms previously. And so they kind of looked at this as the old adage of, this too shall pass. But for the most part, the Jews in Austria were poor and had no real options whatsoever to leave. So my father, understanding the situation early on, because of his political background, immediately registered with the American consulate, which was fortunate because being that there was such a low quota, it came in, it's one of the things that allowed him to be able to attain a visa later on, as I'll demonstrate as we talk further. But on your left of your screen is the registration that he made on March 31st, which was only 19 days after the Anschluss. And he registered his entire family, including his Henny, who was his fiancée, and my mother at the time, her brother, Max Goldmark, his parents, Irma and Arthur Reiner, and my mother's parents, Gedalia and Myro Goldmark. My father also attempted at that time to leave to Czechoslovakia and Switzerland because he had an opportunity with some other friends, but on the way down in the stairwell of his building, his mother saw him with the suitcases and begged him to stay. And he decided that at that time that he would try to help her out and stay within Austria for a while. In any event, both my mother and my father at that point decided that it was in their best interest to apply to as many countries as possible to see if they could get a visa. So there was probably a dozen or so that they did. In any event, what you're seeing in the picture in front of you is a line in front of the police station in Vienna where the Jews are attempting to enter so that they can get documentation papers that would allow them to leave the country should they have other countries that are willing to accept them. Then in July 1938, Hitler decided that he would demonstrate to the world or give the world the opportunity to accept the Jews. So he sponsored the Avion conference in Switzerland where 32 countries participated. Of course, that was a demonstrated failure as none of the countries that participated were willing to increase their quotas. In fact, some of them actually decreased them. At the time in 1938, The US quota was 27,000, and it maintained that number through until the end of the war. To give some perspective on that, in 1938, 1939, there were 300,000 applications alone from Germany and Austria. In 1938, to provide additional perspective, there were 182,000 Jews in Vienna. And shortly after the Anschlag, 109,000 left and went to other countries that were even, assumably countries in which, after they were occupied, they were not able to really escape from. So we don't know how many of those actually survived. By the end of October 1942, 66,000 of the remaining Viennese Jews were deported to camps. And at the end of the war, only 5,000 remained in Vienna, most of those who had married German nationals or successfully were able to hide. So following the Anschluss, there was a period of formalized branding. So as you can see from the passport on the left, there's a large red J standing for Jewish. And that's my mother's passport, actually, where preceding her name, it says Sarah, which all female Jews had to have put on their name. And the men had Israel put on their passports and other papers. Also, Jews at that time were portrayed throughout the newspapers and signs and posters as subhuman or unto-mention. And of course, these posters and signs were distributed throughout Austria in store windows and trolley cars, park benches, wherever there was visibility for passerbys to take notice. It was a very successful propaganda campaign. Then on September 1st, 1941, the decree was made that Jews over the age of 6 were required to wear the yellow Star of David, which you're probably likely familiar with. The labeling and prohibitions continued and went to levels that were unheard of, and even today people don't believe them. But on your left is documentation that my father received from the Jewish community of Vienna, which he was required because he needed to demonstrate the percentage of Jewishness that he held. In this case, he was documented as being a full Jew or full Jew because his parents were Jewish and his grandparents were Jewish. That qualified him as a full Jew. Also at that time, other prohibitions existed, such as the marriage of sexual relations between Jews and Germans were prohibited. So my parents were obviously at that time very committed to one another, and they made the decision that if they were going to flee, they should do it by first getting married, which they did on July 24th, 1938. And they got married at that time at the Stadttemple with 84 couples. And the reason there was that many couples is because the Germans had proclaimed that July 31st, 1938 was the last time that Jewish weddings would be permitted. And so everybody ran off to try to beat the deadline. They did get married on that date, and they married at the Stadttemple, which was in the center of Vienna, which was the only one of 94 synagogues that was not burned. And the reason for that was on Kristallnacht. And the reason for that is that the building was situated adjacent to another building that held official public records, and the Germans wanted to protect the building. So here's an interesting series of pictures that I just recently discovered that I wanted to share with everyone. It's a picture of my parents in front of the Stadttemple on July 24th, 1938, where the 80 or couples or so were standing around waiting for their turn to go inside. And on the right are my parents, Kurt and Henny. And what's interesting about that picture is that I noticed my mom was wearing a corsage when I just saw it a few weeks ago, and it looked familiar to me. So I went back and I noticed, and as I suspected, that it was the same outfit that she was wearing on her wedding day, and the corsage is obvious there. So anyway, that made me aware of the fact that I had these very historic pictures of people perhaps being married for the last time in Austria until the end of the war. And then I found this other interesting picture, which I wanted to include, which was taken on the Kristallnacht when the Germans went in front of the Stadttemple, the same area that I just showed you, and were guarding the building so that it wouldn't be burned down. Also interesting about the Stadttemple is that a few weeks ago, you might have read in the papers about the terrorist attack in Germany, and that it took place at the same place, with the target being the suspected target being the Stadttemple. So if anybody questions whether history repeats itself, I think we have proof. So Kristallnacht actually occurs on November 10th, 1938. And I look at this as phase 2 as the real push to intimidate. And it wasn't the, it wasn't the, I call it the push to intimidate because it wasn't part of the final solution, which I'll talk about later, which was to annihilate the Jews, but it's basically to intimidate them, to get them to leave. And it followed the failed Avion conference that I talked about earlier, where Germany tried to prove to the world that nobody wanted the Jews and was quite successful. In any event, Kristallnacht was referred to as the night of broken glass because so many shop windows were broken and glass was strewn about the streets. My father was arrested November 10th, and along with 30,000 other people sent to various camps, 11,000 to Dachau, 10,000 to Buchenwald, and 9,000 to Sachsenhausen. And you can see here a picture of a similar situation where Jews are being loaded onto the freight cars that basically had no ventilation and no toilet facilities. He spent 3 days and nights on that without any real, anything to drink or eat. So their destination, my father's destination, as it turned out, was the Dachau, which is depicted in this picture with, as you can see, the barbed wire and electrified fence and the moat and the watchtowers. And he arrived in the dead of winter. It was below freezing for most of the time. It was full of vermin, disease, lice everywhere. For nutrition, the prisoners were given basically potato soup and salty herring. And then they had roll calls 4, 5, 6 times a day where they were asked to stand out in the freezing cold. And for punishments, they received beatings and various other kinds of torments. So a few incidents that my father reported that happened to him while he was there was on the first day, the person standing next to him was shot. Another inmate at a later time was caught praying in the washroom and was beaten to death. And another situation where a prisoner was marched back into camp beating a drum who had escaped, and the rest of the camp was forced to stand out on roll call for 24 hours during the freezing temperatures. And God knows how many people died as a result of that incident due to exposure. So at that time, as I pointed out earlier, that it was the purpose was mainly to intimidate and get people to leave Germany. So it was still possible if you could prove that you had a transportation out and a visa to another country, that they would allow you to leave. Expelling the Jews was the main objective, and the final solution to exterminate did not take place until over 2 years later, on January 20, 1942, at the Wannsee Conference. So because my father was able to get out, my mother went about and found somebody to help her get phony papers that stated that my father had a job waiting for him in Uruguay, which was, of course, not true. But she had to present that and steamboat tickets to Gestapo headquarters in order to get my father's release. Of course, there was no way to enter Uruguay anyway without a visa. So on January 29, 1939, my father was released from the gates of hell, but he had nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. He had lost 30 pounds, but the Germans didn't want people going back and demonstrating that they were poorly treated. So they gave him a yellow tie to wear when he presented himself back into civilian life. Although he only had 72 hours to leave, otherwise he was potentially subject to getting rearrested. So without any place to really go or hide, they had to look for other kinds of alternative. And through the help of the Jewish community in Vienna, they were able to hook up with this youth group called the Hashomer Hazer. And you can see my father's youth card on the left. It's also, I would also like to note that his middle name there, Israel, was added because, as I said, that the male Jews were required to carry that name with them for identity purposes. In any event, they went to FISCHAMEND, which provided basically free labor to the farmers in exchange for kibbutz training for potentially relocation in Palestine. And the camp was monitored by the SS. But the main capability that the camp provided for my parents, aside from the fact that allowed them to remain safely in Germany, Austria for the time being, was that it also gave them the opportunity to seek other ways out of the country and to find different avenues of escape. And so while they're there, they learned about Italy opening up their borders for people who could pay approximately, in English pound, about 20 English pounds, which was split between the Germans and the Italians as a tariff, and the border was opened. So you would think that they're home free now. Of course, that wasn't the case for Jews in Europe who were under this scourge. And even though they got a 2-month transit visa to Italy, they were only there a couple of weeks when Mussolini made the decree that the Jews are not of Aryan race, and I want all Jews out of Italy. And he threatened to put them on the German border if they didn't comply. So again, my parents are put into another state of panic. I don't know if they ever came out of the previous one, but my father, being who he was, decided that he would take a train to Ventimiglia, which was on the Italian Riviera, and explore other opportunities perhaps to get into France. So they arrive in Ventimiglia, and he does some more fishing around, and he hears about it. He hangs out at a refugee restaurant, which he had heard about, and he learns of this merchant named Ettore Basse, who turned out to be a prominent member of the Commerspit underground, which was smuggling Jews into France. So he strikes up a friendship with him and his wife, Esther. And Esther and Tory decided to sponsor my parents, because other people had to pay a significant amount of money to be part of the smuggling. And that about a week or so after they meet with the Bassis, they are put on a boat from Bordigera, which was a neighboring village, and they cross the Ligurian Sea into Antibes, where they land on September 1st, 1939. A side note of the story is that Bassi and his son Marco, which my father learned about after the war by getting in contact with Esther Bassi, were arrested by the Nazis when they came into Italy, and they were turned in by the relationship they had with the chief of police. Anyway, they went to Auschwitz and were murdered there in 1943.
Oh.
So again, we think that, now that they're safely in France, that they're on home safe turf, but that again was not the case. So because on September 3rd, Germany invades Poland and France declares war on Germany. And believe it or not, my father is arrested as an enemy alien because he held a German passport, despite the fact that he was in Dachau and was Jewish. They interned him at the Aisde Mill, which was an old brick tile factory depicted on your left that was filthy and had dust from the old tile just floating around. The hay and straw floors were the only comfort that they had. The limited toilet facilities for, I believe it was like 20 for something like 2,500 internees. And the shower facilities was like a long pipe with holes punched in it. The fortunate part about the Aisde Mill is it served as a sanctuary. And I should have mentioned that while my father was in Aisde Mill, he met up with this man named Joseph Eller, who was a former Austrian and had moved to France and had been arrested mistakenly. But after he proved that his wife and his children had been with him for 5 years and they were students in school, they released him. Well, on his way out, my dad approached him and told him about my mom being in Marseille, living in off soup kitchens. And Eller agreed to provide her with some domestic work during the day to supplement her living. So Aisde Mill is a safe sanctuary for my dad at this point, allowing him to remain in touch with my mother, who is living in Marseille. And they were able to communicate. In fact, they wrote over 200 letters to each other, which I have in my possession. Also interesting about Aisde Mill is there were other, or there were more famous people than my dad that were there, including Chagall and the famous novelist Voigtvanger. And both of those managed to get released as well. But the 2,500 or so that remained there after the Germans marched into France were later transferred to Drancy and then to Auschwitz, most of which were murdered there. So my father, had he not gotten out of Aisde Mill, would likely not be here today as well. So on the path to America, I have to go back and point out an incident that occurred that was instrumental to my parents getting released. And we're sometime in November, my mother took a letter and desperately wrote to Altman's department store in New York. The reason she picked Altman's was that her mother's maiden name was Altman, and she was hoping that that would somehow convince the people who owned Altman to help them. Anyway, after mailing the letter, she left the post office and she breaks down in tears and cries on the steps, realizing how desperate she was and how hopeless the situation was. And she's noticed by a Greek American woman who comes over and says, "My dear, what is wrong? Why are you crying?" And my mother says, the situation is hopeless. My husband's in Dachau. They're killing all the Jews. We're never going to get out of here alive. So the woman said, "Well, I'm going back to the States in a couple of weeks. When I do go, I'll see what I can do for you." And she kept her word. She went to the Portuguese Spanish synagogue in New York, and she met with the Reverend David de Sola Poole, who is the preeminent Sephardic rabbi. And she asked Dr. David Poole if she could help my parents, if he could help my parents. And he knew of a philanthropist named Simon Sawyer who had helped other people. So Sawyer was contacted and he agreed to write an affidavit and sponsor my dad. And I just want to read this brief paragraph to you that's in the affidavit. It says, "I am willing to help Mr. Reiner come to the United States because under the special circumstances of today, I feel that a profound and compelling duty exists requiring Americans like myself to announce and declare in unmistakable accents their faith in the democratic principles and the democratic and human spirit of the United States. I feel also that the most effective way of declaring this faith is the way I have chosen, namely by extending practical and immediate help to the victims of the anti-American spirit." So wouldn't it be nice if America continued to feel similar to Simon Sawyer today, and that we could go back to a policy of where we start helping other people who are in similar difficulties? So here's a picture of Simon Sawyer on the left and the Reverend de Sola Poole on the right. So we would think again that this was, they had an easy shot out, but that was not to be. They had the visas, but no transportation. My mom went to the highest, which is the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society in Marseille, and asked for a boat passage, which they refused. And she wrote my dad and said, "I can't get any money, we're still stuck here." And my father went to the commander at the AUSTRIA and asked for a pass to Marseille to see if he could talk to Hayes himself, and he was refused. So he decided to take matters into his own hands and snuck out at night through a window, a basement window in the AUSTRIA facility, and dug a hole under the barbed wire fence, hitchhikes to Marseille, meets up with Eller and my wife, borrows $2, and sends a telegram to Sawyer asking for boat transportation money. Sawyer receives it while he's at a New York fundraiser, passes a hat, and agrees to send him the $400 boat transportation. My father, of course, decides that it's in his best interest to report back to AUSTRIA. So he asks Eller to drive him back, and the next day he knocks on the door and asks for permission to enter. Of course, the commander is upset with him for leaving without him giving him the go-ahead, and decides to take away any food for the next 2 days. But my father, being a hero to the other prisoners, they sneak in extra rations to him. So he eats better than he ever has before. So that was a good story for that particular segment of my father's situation. Anyway, they board the boat on May 19th, and it's a 7-day journey to the United States. They're allowed to leave the AUSTRIA facility because anyone with visas and boat tickets in hand was permitted to leave. And they get on the boat as the Nazis are marching towards Paris. They had already entered through Belgium. And a month later, in fact, on June 14, 1940, the Nazis do, in fact, reach Paris. The SS Champlain arrives in the New York port May 26th, but on its way back, 3 weeks later, the boat runs into a mine and then is torpedoed by a German U-boat. So when my parents get off the boat at the New York harbor, my mother attracts the attention of an AP photographer because she's wearing the hat that's, and this is the actual picture and article. She's wearing a hat that shows the Triple Alliance of France and the flags of the Triple Alliance, the flags of the United States, Britain, and France. And I guess because of my mother's good looks, she becomes more of a celebrity than 3 other passengers, Dr. Clarel, who won a Nobel Prize in medicine, the Baron de la Grange, who was the French senator, and the Vladimir Nabokov, who was the author of Lolita. Anyway, this was distributed to main newspapers throughout the United States, and my father always liked to brag that this was his notice to everybody that they had successfully arrived in America. So the situation is a little difficult because my parents, of course, you know, they're immigrants to the United States and they didn't really have any roots here, and my father hadn't established a career yet. So they went to the highest in New York, the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, and they were told that if they go west, their chances of getting employment were much better than staying in New York. So they gave them tickets on a Greyhound bus, and that's off they went. So initially, my parents did migrant work. My father loaded Del Monte fruit cans onto freight cars, and my mom did pluck turkey feathers and did bean picking on the field. And then on December 7th, 1941, of course, Japan bombs Pearl Harbor and America declares war. And my father's immediately hired at Kaiser because of his engineering background, and Willamette Iron and Steel to help build the Liberty ships. So while he's there, about 2 months or so thereafter, he gets a visit from the FBI and an admiral of the base due to the Enemy Aliens Act, and they tell him that he has to wear an identifying badge. And he says, okay, that's fine. And they say, they give him the badge and it says enemy alien on it. And my father goes, I'm not wearing a badge that says enemy alien. He said, you know where I came from? I just came back. I just came from Germany. I was in Dachau concentration camp. I'm not being branded in the United States. I came here for freedom and I want to live my life that way. So the agents said, okay, well, we understand. And 2 days later, they came back with a different badge and it said friendly agent, which my father also refused to wear. But in the picture on the left is actually Willamette Iron and Steel, where they had 10,000 people listening to my father after they asked him to speak on the subject of freedom, knowing his background. And I won't read you the whole transcript, but the main part of it that I really enjoyed was where he said, you never really appreciate freedom until you've lost it. America is the hope and prayer of the world. So my father, at the end of the war, or near the end of the war, recognized that those jobs were going to end soon. So he goes back to New York with my mom, and he takes a sort of different job, but they're all basically on a career path. And in the 1950s, he starts working for Republic Aviation as the principal design, Republic Aviation Corporation, as the principal design engineer, and he helps build the F-84, the F-105, and the Mohawk OV-1. Later in 1965, which was one of his better accomplishments, he goes to work for Grumman Aircraft Corporation, and he works on the Lunar Excursion Module, which brought Neil Armstrong to the moon. So I like to state that, Germany's loss was America's gain, which I think is quite obvious at this point. So with the good comes the bad. And unfortunately, my father tried to get his parents and my mother's parents out of Germany, but the affidavits and visas arrived too late and they were already deported. They wound up in June and August at this forest outside of Minsk called Mali Trostinsk, which claimed 7,000 lives. 7,000 people Jews were murdered there. And the reports are that most of the people were either gassed in van or they were taken to march to a ditch and shot in the back of the neck. So this is my parents in 1985, or I should say sometime during the 1980s, and I wanted you to have a picture of them at that time. And I always like to end with this song that comes from Hamilton, and if I can play it. So whenever I hear this song, I always think of my parents, and I always think of the obligation that children of survivors and children of victims of the Holocaust have the obligation to tell their parents' story.